Ladies and gentlemen, good evening to everyone joining us from Atlanta, Georgia, and rest of the East Coast here in the United States. Good afternoon to everyone joining us from the West Coast, and then good morning to everyone joining us from Japan. My name is Yoshi Domoto. I am the Executive Director of the American Society of Georgia. We are a nonprofit organization that basically brings together the Japanese and American communities together here in the state of Georgia in the United States. But we are so thrilled to have so many of you today with us to talk about forecasting the 5 ways COVID-19 could play out. We have our specialists from Japan talking with us and sharing their insights with us, but we only have about an hour to discuss this important topic. So without further ado, we will go right into the topic. But at first, we have the president of Wagner & Company, Mr. David Wagner. Hello, David.
Hi there.
And then from Milestone International Incorporated, President and CEO, Mr. Dylan Scudder. Hello, Dylan.
Hello, Yoshi.
And then our esteemed moderator from Georgia Tech Cyber, the Center of International Research and Education Business, Mr. Jim Hoadley. Hello, Jim.
Hi, thanks, Yoshi. So in the interest of time, and since we've already gone through the introductions, I think we'll get right into the questions. So let's start with the title of the talk, Forecasting 5 Ways COVID-19 Could Play Out. What exactly are you referring to here? Dylan, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. So, well, as you know, the future is by definition, of course, always uncertain. So that creates an eternal need for planning, thus forecasting. So a lot of people will be wondering, what does this actually mean in a crisis? Well, it's especially true in a crisis, including the big one that we've all been living through these past months. We can't know, of course, in detail. Even the best model won't give us the granular level of detail that we'd all like to have. But we simply can't know what's coming up, say, in the next months and years. But we can reflect on lessons learned in the past, and we can certainly apply some logic to develop plausible scenarios and basically draw on those hard-won lessons. The fact that we're here in Japan doesn't really mean that I would apply, say, a different model. I would use the same model, but we might, for example, have the same number of options available to choose from than you would have there in the US. But say culture or risk behavior would definitely play a role in how we choose from those options. And we might also justify our decisions differently because, well, different cultures will be persuaded by different arguments. So, we might have competing values like, say, personal freedom versus collective well-being, that type of thing. I don't know, maybe more importantly, going forward, coming at this from 2 different countries, we really ought to try and bring an open mind to, share notes with the aim of refining our plans as a result and basically getting all around better results in our respective countries.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think Japan's actually done a great job of watching and learning from others. They've sort of shot for the middle, as it were. They're not as restrictive as China, but not as free and open as Sweden in terms of their strategy. But this strategy that they've taken does not really surprise me and was surely, the result of consensus formation by relevant players in the decision-making process. Let's remember that every crisis is unique. This crisis is very different from Fukushima, where we had 3 nuclear reactors melting. There was little time for critical decision making. But with COVID-19, there's fortunately more time. And so we can ask, did Japan wait too long and lose precious time while deciding what to do? And the answer might be yes, I don't know. But so did the United States, and so did Europe. So if the goal was not to inundate the medical system, if that was the primary goal, then taking time to adequately prepare was reasonable in some sense. Are the medical facilities sufficiently up to the task now in Japan? And are there really fully acceptable patient numbers? Both COVID-19 and normal emergency patients can access the hospitals if they need to. That's up for debate. They've added hundreds of ICU beds in recent weeks around the country. Is that enough? Not sure. But just yesterday, authorities announced a change in criteria for encouraging people to seek medical attention. So until now, it's been, you have to have a temperature of 37.5 degrees Celsius for 4 days with respiratory problems before you're allowed to have a test. Now the symptoms can include fatigue, for example. So that's progress. And again, you know, a crisis requires agile responses.
Okay, so is there a reason that you've chosen the number 5, Dylan?
Yes, that's a good question. I think the shortest answer to that is probably one left us by Aristotle of all. So, you know, he said you can have A or B, or you could have both, or you could have neither. So that already gives us 4 possibilities. Now, if you think of those 4 as the 4 corners of a square, we just add a 5th point to the middle as a kind of compromise between those possibilities. So there you have the reason for the number 5. Now, for anyone interested in digging in a little deeper there, you can just Google Aristotle's square of opposition. Great reading for those lonely hours. So yeah, how do we apply this to scenario planning? Imagine you start with a couple of scenarios. So you've got a best case and a worst case scenario. I think we can all relate to that. Then you add one in between these. So there you've got an in-between scenario that includes some of the good and some of the bad. Now imagine that you're not satisfied with any of those 3. So you just sort of build it up from there. You decide then to try instead to collect more information. In this case, you might also go back and revisit the information that you already have. This is especially popular as one of the options because in a pandemic, naturally the situation is constantly evolving. So you'll naturally want to go back and always get more information and revisit the information you collected previously. But finally, try to imagine that, you know, we reject all 4 of those previous 4 scenarios as somehow, you know, too static. You know, so we've mapped out best case, worst case, something in the middle. We've visited the 4th option there of, you know, maybe just collecting more information before we make any decisions. But there's something about those 4 that doesn't quite do it yet. So we create a 5th scenario that puts the other 4 scenarios in question. So we try to develop this one with the idea in mind that the other 4 were based on some kind of false assumption. So what we're really doing here is trying to avoid a blind spot. So now we have all of our 5 categories, so good starting point maybe. And now the real work begins of actually developing those scenarios in more detail. So we'd fill those in with some data, as it becomes available, then weigh up the likelihood of each scenario, and then proceed accordingly. So maybe a final comment on this. You might be wondering, well, okay, how do you apply that then, say, to Japan? If we get into cultural discussions. My experience, just being here for 20 years, I say just because I know that that's really just getting started. After 20 years anyway, there's generally a natural aversion, I would say here, to extreme solutions. So anytime you get an option of, say, do A or B, there'll be a natural, almost allergic reaction to, surely there are more options here. So I think there is an aversion to extreme solutions or excessive decisiveness. Now, when presented with a choice between A and B, that basically turns out as this kind of aversion that I mentioned. So there'll be some, I think, ideas there around creative combinations, maybe. Could we combine some of the good with the bad there? But more than anything, there seems to be an attraction, I think, here to the idea of collecting and analyzing more data before jumping into any kind of conclusions. That was that 4th option that I mentioned earlier. This might be in some cases the more sensible move, but it also comes with an opportunity cost of its own, because those decisions that require quicker timing, you won't be able to take advantage of.
Yeah, and I agree. I would add that underlying assumptions must always be tested and retested in any crisis. And I think Japan has been reasonably flexible in changing as it sees certain things are working and other things are not. So they revised their criteria, such as seeking, medical attention, which was just announced yesterday. So again, there's the need for agility, but there's always the question of whether decisions were right or wrong. And for example, the decision to send 2 face masks a couple of weeks ago to every household in Japan, for me, was both late in coming and also only semi-useful in my mind. And it also cost $500 million to execute. So would it have been better to do this in February? Yeah, probably. Same thing with planning for more ICU beds 2 or 3 months ago. Maybe, in fact, that's what the authorities were doing. They just didn't say anything. But I do think that the Japanese officials were, in fact, using the downtime to prepare. I feel comfortable saying that.
Okay, thank you very much. For the next question, I have to preface it by saying that it's very tempting for me to throw in my own slot, having taught business statistics, but for the sake of everyone, I will stay mum on that. How does modeling work in general? And is there anything unique about Japan in terms of crisis modeling? Dylan, do you have insights?
Yeah, Jim, I'm going to bring you in later now that you've mentioned business statistics. But yeah, I think Japan's crisis response so far has been characterized by two things, I would say, to just simplify it. We've got averaging on one side, so just sort of looking out globally, what are the top performers doing, and then trying to strike the middle. So basically sort of amalgamating and looking for, what's the average. After identifying the average as sort of the general direction to aim for, that's then followed up with a form of leniency. And I'm using that word to basically mean after a decision has been suggested, you then leave it to the public to decide, to what degree they actually want to move forward with that. So I'll break that down a little bit. Averaging is basically identifying those top performers according to criteria. Now those criteria haven't necessarily been made public. So we know perhaps to a degree what the criteria are, but we're usually informed, after the decision's been made that this is the general direction we're going for. That leniency then, to break that down a bit, is basically, as I mentioned, leaving it to the public to decide, to what extent they rise to that level, to the suggested level. But that basically means you're not rewarding or punishing people for following or not following that mid-level recommendation. But to your question about modeling, I think it's always based on assumptions. We hear that a lot these days, and I'm sure that resonates with your work as well. But a model can only be as good as the assumptions that it's based on. And you can have a really solid model, but we've seen how that sometimes doesn't work out. I'll come back to that a little bit later. So some of the contradicting models that we see out there with the Imperial College, I think Neil Ferguson is getting a lot of attention, maybe unwanted attention, for having essentially been a little or a lot off the mark. And then we've got Oxford that weighed in later to try and balance that out. That's one of the best known examples of how you can see contradictions that are out there based on these models. As for Japan, I have reservations about, say, cultural determinism. I don't really think that just because you're from culture X, you're bound to behave in a certain way in a given situation. That said, we do have behavioral tendencies, without a doubt, as individuals. And I think each of us as individuals, again, we've been shaped by the values that make up our cultures. So there is some overlap there.
Yeah, so I slightly differ with Dylan on this issue of predictable behavior in Japan. I've been here over 30 years, and I'm not saying all Japanese are the same. We know that Ginza Japanese and Shibuya Japanese are not the same, but there's a lot of predictable behavior in Japan. And there's also a lot that's unique about Japanese decision-making. So for instance, the process of ringi seido, or bottom-up decision-making to overcome hierarchy, is effective, but it takes a lot of time to do and is not terribly efficient. So traditionally, ringi seido has been used by an organization or a department inside a company by its members who need to put their stamp of approval on a document or show that they've reviewed it. And that approval or confirmation of having seen a document is done with a hanko, which is a personal stamp. Again, passing an envelope around an office with 100 people who confirm with their hanko that they've acknowledged seeing something is very time consuming. But here comes technology, which is changing things a bit. So now there are apps for virtual hanko. And so that's blending technology with tradition that will help Japan maintain its tradition, but speed things up a little bit. So even so, are hanko a good tool for fast-moving crisis in general? I'd argue no, but that's the way things are.
I do want to point out, David, that in your example, you selected two neighborhoods in Tokyo as representing the extremes of Japanese opinion. Having lived in the very, very hinterlands of Shikoku, I think that there's an even wider range of opinions than even that. And folks from that part would probably lump the two of them together. But anyway, so of the 5 scenarios that you're laying out here, where are you putting your money? And David, let's start with you.
Yeah, again, so as I said earlier, I'm putting my money on shooting for the middle. Nothing radical. You know, it's tried and tested and based on consensus formation by relevant players. You know, if we ask what are the likely outcomes down the road for COVID-19 and how does this work? Well, many of the challenges now facing US firms already confront Japanese firms. So for instance, do they all need all that office space and do they need to pay for all that rent? Same thing going on in the States. You know, can people work effectively from home? The Japanese preference for face-to-face encounters is still the preferred communication style if they have a choice. But times change, and we know that the lifetime employment system, for example, has historically applied for larger firms where you're guaranteed a job for the next 40 years once you join. But that's changing too. Meritocracy is increasingly a factor in employee performance and retention, not just historical presence with the firm. So, you know, jobs are increasingly no longer guaranteed here, and I don't think anything is. It's changing radically with this crisis. But, you know, Japan will continue to be good at doing what it does, and I don't think that much is really going to change here. There will be some minor changes, like maybe more teleworking, but I don't think much else is going to change.
Yeah, if I could just join in there, I would say, yeah, if the question is, you know, which of the five are we thinking about, I personally would say bet on all five. But seriously, I think we should keep in mind that, you know, there is a dynamic nature to this pandemic response because of the collective decision making over the course of a crisis. You just inevitably have a situation where you might start with one of those five options and then, you know, move to another. So you can map out and forecast, you know, different scenarios, but we shouldn't get locked into the idea that, you know, just one of those will be how things actually work out. You could actually have some movement between them, which I think is part of the way a pandemic also evolves. So I think looking at, you know, the many isolated decisions that we've seen so far here in Japan, so how Japan has responded to COVID-19 so far, I think it's reasonable to assume that we'll continue to see, you know, some form of shuttling. If we have to really sort of zoom in and identify two of those five scenarios that are most likely, I think you'll see shuttling between, on the one hand, the ongoing data collection and analysis. You just can't get away from that. We know more today than we knew yesterday. We'll know more tomorrow than we know today. It's just unfolding at that speed. So you're definitely going to have some time spent on that scenario. But then there'll be shuttling between there and then some different forms of burden sharing. I think, you know, when we return to a work life that's more conservative than ever, and I agree that, you know, things won't change here. In fact, if they do change, I would guess that all of the fears that have been you know, stoked through this whole experience are going to drive people to try and forget this as fast as possible, and also from a business perspective, try to make up for lost time. So I think, yeah, discussions of a new normal or, you know, big talk of opportunities for innovation and that type of thing, unfortunately, would probably be dismissed as you know, happy talk.
That very realistic. Thank you. Next question. How would you rank Japan's performance in terms of managing the crisis thus far? We'll start with David.
Sure. So, you know, during the Fukushima crisis in 2011, I was working with the Prime Minister's communication team for 3 weeks, you know, inside the epicenter of power. It was really an interesting experience for me, and I learned a lot. And I like to compare Japanese crisis to Fukushima. And even though they're very, very different, there's a lot of overlap. So let me start with Fukushima. Fukushima was a true natural disaster of epic proportions, right? It was one of the largest ever recorded earthquakes with a massive tsunami stretching kilometers inside Japan. So it was true destruction on a global scale. Now, in terms of communication during that crisis, I felt that Japan left a lot to be desired in terms of sufficient and accurate information delivery, keeping the public informed with transparent, rapid, and open and honest communication. That was, I think, what needs to happen. And the government was criticized for not doing it. And they learned a lot from that, I think. And we compare that now to COVID-19. How is Japan communicating this time? And I think if we look at the Hokkaido governor's response with the initial outbreaks in February, very quick movement in terms of decision-making, transparency, in terms of regular announcements about the emergency, and again in April when there was a second announcement. So the governor of Hokkaido built trust quickly and maintained it. Governor Koike of Tokyo has been doing the same thing through her daily press briefings in Japanese and once or so a week in English. But people basically trust her, and I call that progress.
Yeah, I think you raised a lot of important points there, David. And I just add to that, as I mentioned earlier, the characteristics of the response so far seem to be developing, recommendations based on global averaging, and then being lenient about the public's subsequent follow through. I think of this as what I'm calling hypothetical decision making. What I mean by that is, basically working on the assumption that the average is always the safest bet, sort of as a step one. But then never really testing that assumption by forcing anyone to go along with it. So, the result of this approach is what you might expect, a kind of mix of good and bad with all the advantages and disadvantages. For example, on the ground here, you would see just a kind of pedestrian story here, but you'd notice that the government will tell people, yeah, sure, go out, but do wear a mask if you go outside. And then they won't enforce that in any way. So effectively, you end up rewarding those who don't bother wearing a mask, and you punish those who do. So, if you think about a meeting, for example, you set a time for everyone to get there. And then if you sort of wait for the latecomers, it's a similar situation. So you don't start until those who come late, arrive. And the people who are there on time are sort of indirectly punished for being on time. So I think that's kind of what you end up with these kind of half measures. A strategic advantage, of course, is also that you can always say that you did tell everyone to do the right thing.
Okay, I just wanted to add a little bit to what David said, because I was very close to the 1995 Hanshin great earthquake and fire in Kobe. And just as a source of comparison, now I was witnessing Fukushima and the March 11, 2011 disasters from afar. But I was very involved in the process of the news cycle of getting information out there and making sure that people received accurate information. And you are correct that Japan was not very good at that. But I will say, in terms of the original earthquake and tsunami or disaster after that, the experience of March 11, 2011 was much, much better than January of 1995. And not just in terms of the technology and resources that were available, but also in terms of the government's response. And I think in 2011, it was the nuclear reactor that they had not prepared for that. But the good news, of course, is that as Japan experiences these incredible tragedies, they do tend to learn, and the next time that they encounter it, they respond better. So sorry, I'm hijacking. Much has happened since we first started hearing about COVID-19. And we're living in a world where pandemic is a word that even my daughter who goes to third grade understands. How is this likely to continue, and what's next? I'll pass it to you, Dylan.
Yeah, so you're basically asking how you think how the pandemic is going to unfold going forward, or did you want me to address anything more specific there?
I think, yeah, just the average, how you think it's going to be addressed going forward.
Yeah, okay, well, I'm a scenario planner, so I tend to look more at the corporate sector and how that is likely to develop. So, I'd obviously like to see all companies running scenarios all the time to improve their readiness for recovery and for the resurgences that we can expect. But I think most are actually taking steps that I would describe, in fact, as minimal or measured at best. So, like most of us, they're watching and learning. But I see the old problem of having, say, more plans about what to do versus actually having tried and tested capacities in-house. Yeah, of course, some industries are faring better than others. I think the usual suspects, travel, hotels. These are all seeing significant declines in sales, while pharmaceuticals or those in retail are benefiting. On the whole, however, demand is clearly down, and I think the smaller companies are going to be looking at some of the temporary advantages that teleworking offers, and exploring the implications of extending new work styles long term. But this depends a lot on organizational culture. Now, the bigger companies, on the other hand, would be looking to METI for direction, so the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry.
Yeah, and I think for me, I mean, in terms of what the question is related to how companies are handling this crisis, you know, my comments are more focused again on Japanese cultural norms and technology. I'm always fascinated by that. And I can think of a few Japanese cultural issues that may become factors in the decision-making process, you know, when combined with new technologies. So for instance, meetings, one reason Japanese prefer face-to-face meetings is so that they can better read the air, or in Japanese, kuki o yomu. They want to watch body language and facial expressions, not just listen on the call to someone's voice. Well, you know, we've got platforms now like WebEx, here we are on Zoom, GoToMeeting, Google Hangout, etc., which companies were using before, particularly in the international divisions, and now we'll be using more. Is this a longer term change? What are the longer term implications? Well, you know, with Zoom, you can see and listen, and just as we're doing now, it's more or less the same as face-to-face. Well, it is and it isn't. Some may ask why we still need to have face-to-face meetings when we've got Zoom. Well, I don't know the answer to that, but there is something about sitting together and reading the air, watching others, and even another Japanese concept of ishin denshin, defined by me as telepathy, that is missing for Japanese with these meetings. They are deeply ingrained cultural norms in Japan used to enhance information assumption deciphering. And it's hard to do when you're not face-to-face. Longer term, will this change? I don't know.
Yeah, I actually agree with the points that you're making there, David. And, you know, just to kind of bring this back to the five scenarios that I was talking about earlier, you know, if the question is, you know, how is the broader pandemic going to pan out, we could think of two extreme scenarios to start off with, an optimistic and a pessimistic, or, you know, the best case and worst case scenarios. So an optimistic scenario would be, let's say, reliable testing is made available for everyone within the next few weeks. And, you know, at the same time, we're going to lift these stay-at-home restrictions in lockstep with an increased capacity at the hospitals. You know, there'll be plenty of equipment and healthcare to go around. Meanwhile, you know, we develop herd immunity just as a range of antibody treatments come out, followed by the big news that, you know, global collaboration has developed this amazing, you know, vaccine 6 months before the Olympic Games. You know, it gets better, but we could imagine, say, the economy starts firing on all cylinders again, and we reach a level of prosperity by the time the Olympics roll around that no one had imagined possible. So happy days are here again. Let's call that the positive or best case scenario. Let's contrast that quickly with the worst case. I'd say a more pessimistic scenario would be something like just the opposite of that. So we move in and out of these miserable lockdowns and returns, you know, back to work, and another lockdown, and then, you know, another season rolls by, and then we're in the winter, and then we get hit by a second wave of the virus, which proves to be, you know, even worse than the first one. Unemployment continues to worsen, suicides and domestic violence hit all-time highs. Just getting started here. So the whole generation becomes fearful of ever having to leave their homes again, let alone think globally or perish the thought, travel abroad. You know, one could easily imagine that this is just the beginning, another mega earthquake like the one we just now talked about, or Mount Fuji erupting, or problems with North Korea. Any and all of these could happen, you know, during this dark period. There's no reason that, you know, they're not waiting for COVID-19 to finish before they step in.
Dylan, you paint a very depressing picture. Let me add to the comments that I see more of the same in terms of fiscal packages and low, if not negative, interest rates in Japan. The cancellation of the 2020 Olympics was obviously a huge blow to so many businesses here. And on top of that, tourism has trickled to almost nothing, as people from 87 countries, including the United States, are not allowed into Japan at this time. In the case of the United States, if you've been in the US up to 14 days prior, you will be sent home. And in fact, I don't think you'll be let on the plane. So it's a very severe situation right now. And even, you know, when these restrictions are eventually lifted, it's a long road to normalcy for the US and Japan in terms of travel. So, you know, airlines have a lot of work to do. They've got to make sure people feel safe and that germ spread is contained and the air systems work. It's a big deal.
Well, one of my favorite sayings is the benefits of being a pessimist is that when you're disappointed, you're not. So I think on the list of questions that we have, I think you kind of covered the optimistic and pessimistic conclusion. So let's move on to the next one. We can see that there are costs and benefits to consider in any action we might take. and that not taking action has, of course, its own costs and benefits. How do we calculate these costs and benefits, Dylan?
Yeah, I might just say that, first of all, there's no shortage of experts on either side of these forecasts. You can take your pick, really. So, we can think of both as equally plausible or implausible at this stage. A more moderate reading of the future, might just be that we assume that, the prudent move forward is to invest more time and resources in monitoring and evaluation measures. So not really taking any specific action until we know more. That could be the kind of scenario we're actually in now, and one that we see going forward, even for weeks to continue. It could also be that we learn more from the strategies applied in other places like Sweden, Singapore, Taiwan. These are, of course, very high on the list. Just notice that they sort of begin to reveal a disturbing conclusion, for example, that everyone fared about the same, whether there was lockdown or laissez-faire. When the dust settled, the death rates were about the same. But it might still be, a little premature to draw any conclusions there. So, wait and see approach might be the wisest move at this point. But in the hope of, optimizing, I think to come to your question about, how do we calculate the costs and benefits? I think you've got, in decision making, we're always tempted to, aim for the middle. So try to kind of hedge your risks by going for the average. And, in that sense, we would be just accepting some of the pessimistic projections, and at the same time, we can't really accept that all of our efforts have been for naught. They have to have counted for something, so it'll be somewhere in the middle. It could be, for example, that teleworking does start to catch on more than we thought, as an example, and that the economy might start to see a slight uptick. That said, the situation does continue to evolve on a daily basis. So, data is going to become more and more precious than ever before. We're trying here to really thread a difficult needle, I think, between the pessimistic and optimistic perspectives, while doing what we can to stay informed, to ensure that our next steps are grounded in sound judgments.
Yeah, and so, to the topic of calculating costs and benefits, I would add that a benefit from this crisis will be seen in the digital infrastructure areas. I think Dylan sort of touched on this, data centers, enhanced cybersecurity, expanded networks and cloud solutions. All of this is going to help promote online learning and teleworking for sure. So a benefit will be noticeable in those areas. The cost will be to traditional business, just like in the United States with retail, for example. And I'm curious to see how many businesses will be able to stay open long-term, both here in Japan and in the United States. And I suspect long-term, like in the US, many will not. The shopping centers are going to be decimated. We already know that. And I'm seeing increasing numbers of restaurants here, not only closed, but they're empty. I mean, their furniture has been taken out. So get ready, there's more of that coming. And I think the SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, just don't have the balance sheets of the larger firms to get through this crisis without help. And there is some help coming, but we can look down the road and imagine that the cost will be higher taxes everywhere in the world. And perhaps in the form of higher taxes will be capital gains will go up, dividend income will be taxed at a higher rate. I think that's easy to guess. But remember that the OECD envisions that Japan needs to have a sales tax of 15% down the road. It's right now 10%. And that chokes off expansion. So you can't spend trillions of yen and dollars, without paying for it. And that's going to be a cost. And that's even if you monetize the debt, you still have to pay for it one way or the other.
Yeah, when I do go out here in Georgia, we are now in the state of Georgia, we are gradually opening up. We are one of the first states to open up, and I do take note of which small businesses in my neighborhood have not survived. And there are definitely businesses that were there that I used to patronize that are gone as a result of this. Yeah. So let's assume that we decide that it's better to take action than to just continue collecting and analyzing data. And the next question is going to sound like some really good dystopian science fiction that's actually coming real before us. Is there anything that we can do to avoid a zero-sum scenario in which one demographic benefits and the other ones suffer? So let's start with David on that question.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And let me approach this from a different perspective. And it's one that I've looked at many times in my 30 years here. non-Japanese as compared to Japanese in Japan. What's it like to be a minority here and you're not a citizen? Well, it's the same thing as in the United States. It's a challenge. And is it really any different in any diverse society on the planet? Probably not. But when resources are scarce like ICU beds, what's the criteria used to decide who gets the bed? Is it based on age? Is it based on gender? Is it based on citizenship or visa status or medical condition? You get my point, and I've written about this. If there's a shortage of ICU beds in Japan, who gets the bed? And I hate to ask the question, but it needs to be asked and prepared for. So I would hope that, criteria based on need is the overriding issue, but I don't know that this is the issue and that it's been discussed in Japan in enough detail.
Yeah, I think David brings up some really important points there, and we'd all like to, avoid that kind of zero-sum situation. I think part of that is, there's just something in us that wants to put another scenario on the menu. I might call this the game changer. So, this would be the scenario that nobody else is talking about. So, and one reason we don't talk about this one is because it doesn't occur to us. It's not, within our frame of reference. So getting outside of that zero-sum thinking requires some reflection. The kind of breaking out of that tunnel vision, I think you can do that with a few critical questions. We can learn, for example, just throw out a kind of wild card scenario here. You can create your own later, but the whole experience, you could imagine, was we look back a year from now and say, wow, that was like a 2020 version of the Truman Show or something like that, where the well-meaning scientists erred on the side of caution, but you can err so far on the side of caution that you fall off a cliff. In a situation like this, a pandemic, it's characterized by uncertainty. So it's a little bit of a stretch to say erring on the side of caution, because that sort of presupposes that someone knows what is cautious and what's not in this case. But let's say well-meaning scientists did err on the side of caution. They created these models that were off by orders of magnitude, but all with good intentions. Politicians then hit the panic button, putting the whole population in lockdown, making sure that the students were all at home instead of at school. This forced a lot of would-be health workers to stay at home, which then led to some tragic pockets of hospitals in crowded areas that were temporarily overwhelmed. We start to kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together. In retrospect, it's a lot easier. We see maybe that the media, though perhaps not fabricating anything, had a tendency of seizing upon really tragic stories. All of this sort of formed a kind of perfect storm. So in combination with fully globalized social media, it magnified everything, blew everything out of proportion, and slowly started to put us in a situation where we were scared to leave our homes. But at the end of the day, we look at the numbers and say, well, it actually was just something kind of like a severe flu. We could look back and just learn that, well, life is no safer or more dangerous than it's always been, and we just move on with our lives. For example, so you could use your own wild card there to, I think, try to get out of the zero-sum space and try to say, well, what kind of fundamental assumptions do we have now that are preventing us from entertaining more creative ways forward? So, just to simplify, I'd say, final comment on this, at the end of the day, you could imagine 3 core questions that will influence our response here in Japan going forward. The first would be very simple. Are we going to prioritize data collection over taking action? So is it going to be a more passive or a more proactive kind of move? The second question, are we going to prioritize extreme measures over moderate measures? So are we going to continue to go with this idea of always aiming for the middle, or are we going to branch out and take some risks? The last point that I think is going to really shape the way things unfold going forward here in Japan would be whether we prioritize one demographic over the other. I think David touched on that, and an example there might be, are we going to essentially favor the frail, the elderly, over, say, the young and healthy? That would be one of the points to keep in mind, I think.
Yeah, and so I'm going to approach this from a different perspective, and I just say that, again, Japanese culture works to Japan's advantage. And I'm thinking of 2 concepts here that work pretty well in a crisis, which is gaman and shoganai. Gaman is to grin and bear it, and shoganai is it can't be helped. So these are really powerful tools that Japan has in its arsenal, and it can't be helped. So let's grin and bear it has been a powerful form of tolerance for many Japanese in difficult times. So, you know, Japan's used to crisis, earthquakes, tsunami, volcanoes, typhoon, you name it, they have it, and they were raised on crisis, and they will persevere through crisis. So I'm confident Japan comes through this pretty well. And I also, you know, like to think about Fukushima again in the sense that, remember, there was no looting during Fukushima, and people stood in line and waited their turn. I mean, it was a civil response in a civil society. And if things get tough, I wonder if it's going to be the same in the United States.
Okay, well, thank you. I do want to make a little procedural comment for those. We are very happy to see the spirited comments going on in the chat section. I just want to let you know that if you actually have a question for the panelists, to go ahead and throw that in the Q&A rather than in the chat section. But we're definitely, you can continue to with the chat, but recognize that it's going to be easier for us to answer them if you put them in Q&A. So before I get into, we did receive some questions ahead of time, and some of them you've already addressed. I'm gonna, since I got a couple of minutes, I'm just gonna use moderator's privilege here, sorry, and ask Nassim Taleb of Black Swan fame is very famous for talking about things that I don't know if he uses the term because we're so ensconced in it, or maybe it's in the term that somebody else uses, but they talk about unknown unknowns. What would you think? Of course, if we could name them, then they're not unknown unknowns. But what do you think some of the known unknowns and some of the unknown unknowns are with regards to this crisis? And we can start with either David or Dylan.
I might just offer a couple of ideas there, and then we can take it from there. So, you know, again, I work with companies, so I tend to focus on what organizations can do. That can include universities, of course, but however an organization decides to run their scenarios, if you're looking at black swan scenarios or so-called perfect storm scenarios, whatever an organization decides to do there in terms of preparation, they definitely need to avoid, you know, at the very least, building in blind spots to those scenarios. So, you know, just basically means, you know, preparing for predictable problems that, you know, you can resolve just using the strengths that you have. There's that old comment about, you know, if the only tool you know how to use is a hammer, you know, suddenly the whole world looks like a nail. And you do need to kind of watch out for that. A good scenario will reveal situations for which the organization is shockingly unprepared for. So, you know, the nature of a perfect storm, like the one we're in now, but the nature of a perfect storm scenario too, it's not only just being, you know, sort of caught by surprise, but it's also discovering that the resources that you need to deal with the threat are suddenly unavailable. So you really improvise under duress. That's an important, I think, way of developing those in-house capacities. Another characteristic is discovering that, you know, after you finally come up with an effective approach, you're unable to really get the level of support that you're expecting from your team. You know, and there's always a rich mix of this kind of technical and human error. So it's, I think, important to keep those elements in play. And then, you know, that's one reason I think it needs to combine also elements of leadership, you know, at the individual level with collective responses at the team level. And then in terms of intensity, I think readiness training is either easier than the actual threat or more challenging. And I'd strongly suggest the latter.
Yeah, and just a quick comment to add to that. I mean, for me, the striking issue right now is what happens for pandemic preparation, not only in Japan and the US, but globally, and how much of that is going to be everlasting. I think this is such a pivotal event for mankind that I doubt very seriously countries and companies and organizations are going to be caught with crisis manuals that don't have pandemic in it anymore. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Okay, great, thank you. I want to go through first the list that we had prior submitted questions. So if we can go through those, the ones that I have, and some I believe you've covered. So if I do skip over them, it's just because I believe that you've covered them already. So the first question, of course, is what can the US and Japan learn from each other on the basis we've had very different responses to the crisis. What do you think we can learn from each other from our differing responses?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I'll focus my answer on my specialty, which is communications. So Japan can improve on its frequency and depth in communications to the populace during a crisis. And the US can improve on accurate, consistent, and fact-based communications. So I think in both cases, the goal is to increase trust to your target audience, which is the populace of each country.
Yeah, I think Davis put it very well. And a lot of the points that I see being discussed, to my mind, sort of jump ahead a bit too far. And what I'd like to see more of is sort of going back to first principles. When we try to answer a question like, what one country can learn from another, in this case, the US and Japan, I think it really starts out with what's our objective? What are we looking at? I mean, we can't really compare performance until we've got, some kind of objective that we've focused in on. That objective changes everything. I think a lot of us are assuming that the objective here is saving lives, for example. Sounds rather reasonable, but there's a subtle and important difference if you focus on, for example, just maximizing the total numbers of life years. So, if you look at younger people over older people, that whole dilemma changes depending on which of those you're giving priority to. And then, Japan would be handling that differently than the US, and you'd get different scores. But I think before we can kind of look at each other and say, how did you fare on this particular battle? I think we need to first kind of step back and say, well, how are we defining the problem? And so for me, that's the starting point.
Okay, great. So I want to take another question, and I want to add a little bit on top of it. I'm really abusing the moderator privilege. I apologize for that. But the question, I want to add to it, the base question is, how can cultural norms help or hinder crisis management? And I want to add to that, the authors, and maybe they didn't coin the term, but I think it's a really good term, Carl Kay and Tim Clark coined a term, cultural arbitrage. Selectively applying, if you're bicultural or multicultural, selectively applying lessons from and reacting as if you are from a different culture. What Japanese or American things can we apply in cultural arbitrage that we can respond better to crises in the future?
Well, I've spoken a lot about culture today, and I think in terms of crisis management. So I think Japan performs at its worst in a crisis. And that's because there's not a lot of time to form a consensus. And so predictability is really important here in Japan, and crises are not predictable. So I think it would be great if Japan could develop some criteria for making quicker judgments. And I think there's a way to streamline that. It would be a good idea if they can do that. Technology probably can help. I always look at Japan and the United States as juxtapositions on almost everything. We're, as Americans, very direct. Japanese are more indirect. We're individual oriented. Japanese are more group oriented. And so if you just go down the list, you're going to see these differences with some overlap at certain points. Can the United States benefit from being more group oriented? Yeah. Can Japan benefit from being more individual oriented? Sure. So we could that's the basis by which I make these kinds of calls.
Yeah, I think, again, very important points there. And when we talk about culture, a lot of the work done by Hofstede, Gerhard Hofstede did a lot of work on cultures and how we respond under different conditions. And in a crisis like this, there's something that also bestseller Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book, Outliers, where he talked about how different cultures respond under stress. He looked specifically at something called the authority gradient. And that becomes relevant in this case, where we're thinking about how are decisions made in groups. The problem that he identified was that some cultures actually crash planes. So he was looking at cockpits and the communication between pilot and co-pilot, and we're heading for a mountain, and do I have the courage to say it, or does the pilot have the ears to hear it? So there's a lot in this authority gradient, I think, discussion about how do we speak up, and especially when you have a situation that has everyone so scared, it's really hard sometimes to just, for example, express the view that it's important to look at the data. Like that very common sense kind of comment can actually, grate on the ear when everyone else is in panic mode and saying, no time for that scientific stuff. We need to make decisions here. Don't let the truth get in the way of a good story kind of logic. So yeah, I think that's something to keep in mind.
Okay. Another question from the list that were pre-submitted. What impact do you think COVID-19 will have on Japan's relationship with the US and other countries in Asia?
Yeah, so that's a big topic. You know, I got a master's degree in political science focused on Japan back in the day. So I love this topic. You know, so I said when Donald Trump became president almost 4 years ago that there would be no change in the relationship in terms of its strength, and there hasn't been. You know, for Japan and China, if we look at that one, I see closer ties. And if we look at the US and China as a whole, I see strained ties. For Taiwan, I think close ties for both Japan and the United States. And for Korea, South Korea, I'd say, you know, Japan will move forward toward rekindling, renewing its reconciled relationship that's been damaged the last couple of years. For North Korea, for everybody, I see more of the same.
Yeah, I think David's spoken for both of us there.
Okay. Let's see. Speaking to the issue of Japan's relationship with China, Japan is encouraging manufacturing companies to move its operations out of China. What effect do you think this will have on Japan's economy, and what impact would this have on Japanese companies in other regions in the world, including the US? And I'm sure that that question was asked from the standpoint that the state of Georgia is a large recipient of Japanese foreign direct investment.
Yeah, well, this is not just Japan, but I mean, all countries and businesses are looking at this whole issue of strategic supply chain production management and movement. I would suspect if there are any critical supplies produced in China, like pharmaceuticals, those are going to be moved back to home country. And I think China is going to have some difficult times ahead as not only businesses relocate out of China, but as a result of that, unemployment in China is going to increase and have a huge domestic impact. And then I think China is going to be spending a lot of its foreign reserves, which are going to get dramatically depleted. So buckle up. I mean, in terms of Japan, I think, yeah, Japanese are also going to move a lot of production back to Japan. And it's interesting, I've been thinking about this. I don't know if it's accurate, but as a result of this crisis, I think unemployment is going to go up here too. And that means that's going to ease the labor shortage here in Japan for a number of years. So let's see how this plays out. Could be very interesting, actually.
Yeah, I think, you know, the crisis clearly amplifies what was there before. So, you know, we had already gone into a heavily, you know, interdependent relationship with China on both sides. And I think that's not going to be something you can easily pull out of. Meanwhile, you know, parallel to that, I think there's a folk wisdom that, you know, you want to put all your eggs in one basket. So meanwhile, we will see some backpedaling, but essentially, you're not going to have any fast changes there because the interdependence was already so heavy before the crisis.
It's very interesting. Thank you both for your responses. It's very interesting, David, that you seem to be indicating that you think that Japan will use this decrease in employment for right sizing, to use a US corporate term, rather than the downsizing or the massive unemployment that we're seeing in the US.
Well, I'm not sure I want to go there. I just was looking at the labor issue itself. I mean, there's a labor shortage here, and it's growing every year. But if unemployment increases as a result of businesses going out of business, then the labor shortage is diminished. So I think it's going to be easier to move operations back here because you'll have the staff to manage it. And I do think that the issue of immigration as a whole is going to increase here in Japan. They're just not producing the babies. Look at the numbers. Long-term, Japan's got tremendous problems with lack of human bodies to do the work. And women and robots can only do so much. You've got to bring non-Japanese in a big way. And Japan's been hesitant to do that for lots of reasons. But it's growing. And it has to, because if you look out 100 years at the population targets and with the impact of that decline on budgets, and we're already seeing it in rural areas. I mean, out of the 47 prefectures last year, 37 prefectures had a population decline. Well, what does that do to their budgets? What does that do to getting things done? It's a huge issue for Japan, and they know it. They know it.
Okay, I apologize, David, if it seemed like I was putting words in your mouth. I was just kind of free-forming there, but putting my own interpretation on it. I apologize for that. Let me hit the last big one, because we are running short on time of those pre-submitted ones, so that we can hopefully get to at least a couple off of the ones that came in while we were talking. What are some methods and techniques that organizations can use for forecasting and running scenarios?
Well, yeah, I tried to lay out, one today already. So I'm a big fan of, general frameworks. I think clearly we have to localize, as I say, you have to take into account the granular detail at the local level. But especially with something as complicated as the pandemic that we're in now, you also do need to have some kind of framework that you can move across different contexts. So starting out with an oldie but goodie, going back to Aristotle and taking his logic of, the square of opposition and applying that to your options, I think it's a good start. You might find other models out there. You can look at the big consulting firms now. They've got, the 3 this and the 7 that. You can look at a step-by-step kind of model. But I think for just a rigorous logic, I think coming up with a framework better than the one that has been now used over the centuries is going to be a tough task. I'd go back to that kind of basic model. You can see that reflected in more modern versions of game theory if that's more the area that you're interested in, but decision science finally.
And then for me, my specialty is crisis communication, so I'll comment from that point of view. I run a lot of simulations in-house for firms and organizations that need to test their executive teams for readiness. So, public and private firms need to do this. You don't buy an umbrella when it rains. So I think this is a logical step to make sure that your teams are ready to go, and make sure that if any crisis happens, you've got some criteria to start the process of making critical decisions.
All right. Well, I am getting signaled that we have pretty much we're at the point that we're ready for our formal closing, and we'll see if David and Dylan are up for after the formal close for going off the record and answering some of the questions that we got in Q&A. So don't give up yet, folks. But we do have to end on time. So I want to turn it over to to Al Hodge of the Japan American Society to close us out. So don't go anywhere.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, David and Dylan, for your excellent remarks. Truly informative and thought-provoking. Japan American Society of Georgia is celebrating our 40th anniversary this year, and we think that's a very important milestone, and of course, very important milestone between Japan and Georgia, business, cultural, personal relationships. Additionally, Japan is the #1 investor in the state of Georgia. And we are very proud of that and are working extra hard to ensure that it maintains and grows. Additionally, we are very proud of the Georgia companies that have invested in Japan. It really is a two-way, healthy, productive relationship. Therefore, all of our programs are based on what I just described: culture, business, relationships. And right now, of course, this great series, which was the brainchild of Yoshi Demoto, our great exec, has really been helpful for keeping communications going, but also good information like was shared this evening. I do invite everyone to look at our website, JASG, or Japan America Society of Georgia, and take a special look at the events that are coming up. We always have a robust schedule, lately virtual, by way of language learning and business connections, seminars and programs that have been helpful, along with some entertainment, some good positive Japanese entertainment. So please continue to monitor the website and the events. Meanwhile, we of course appreciate the members of the Japan American Society of Georgia and look forward to those of you that may be participating, for which we are grateful, to check us out, and please join with so many others across business, cultural, personal, and others that have been a part of Japan American Society of Georgia for 40 years. We're looking for another 40 more. Thank you.